Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 25th. And I wanted to draw your attention to the notes below where I've got our course outline, where I've made some slight adjustments as we are moving into the ending of the semester. So at this point, I should have returned paper number 1 to you if you submitted it in by the deadline. I'm working on the papers that were submitted after the deadline, those that I granted extensions to. So if it turns out that you did submit your paper by the deadline and you have not received it, please let me know. And as you know, you all have the option of revising the first paper. I just ask that you submit in the original with my comments on it along with your revision, and you would get the higher of the 2 grades. You have up until the ending of the semester to do so, but the sooner the better for everyone involved. And I spent a good amount of time with the comments that I make in terms of grammar and mechanics, as well as comments in terms of content at the ending of the paper. So really the best way to learn how to write is to read those comments very carefully and to understand why I would have made those comments. And if you don't, please reach out to me and I'll be happy to explain further. I also realize you might have some difficulty with reading my handwriting. So if that happens to be the case and you can't read my handwriting, please let me know and I will be happy to decipher for you. And if you need further direction too on how to go about a revision, just feel free to reach out to me and we can set up a meeting. In terms of the course outline below, you can see that on Thursday, we are going to be putting some closure onto Emily Dickinson. What I wanted to do today was to talk about Emily Dickinson. I think of Emily Dickinson as basically the transition to the latter part of the semester, now that you've gone through the novel Jane Eyre, which is rather lengthy. And next class, we will not only put closure onto Dickinson, but begin incidents in the life of a slave girl. So I will be including that link as well in our notes below in the event that you don't have access to a paper copy. So hopefully at this point you have finished Jane Eyre. Today's assignment, which I'll talk a little bit more about, is for you to watch a documentary about Emily Dickinson and also to identify one of her poems in your attendance question, or at least a line in her poetry. So that gives you a little bit of breathing room in terms of the reading load before we begin Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I can tell you that in terms of the language, it probably is an easier read. In terms of the content, it's a much more challenging read. Thus far, we've been reading fiction, and we've been reading about lives that are rather privileged. Even Jane Eyre's life is rather privileged compared to slavery. And it's hard to believe that slavery was existing at the same time, but it was. And Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, it happens to be the account of not just a slave, but a female slave. So this makes it very unique. So, our central character can talk about both slavery in terms of an institution, but also talk about it from the perspective of gender. But I warn you that this is a brutal, ugly read, and it's only worse because it's true, and I think that's why we need to read it, because it is so brutal and it is so ugly that we need to understand our history before we can change our history. And in terms of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, I suspect that we will finish it on Tuesday. That happens to be the 2nd of July, so we are on the cusp of moving into July. And we will begin our last text of the semester. That happens to be The Awakening. So we are visiting Kate Chopin again. You'll remember that we started the semester with Kate Chopin's short story, The Story of an Hour. We end the semester with Kate Chopin's novella, The Awakening, which was considered to be so controversial and so subversive that it basically ended her career. Our class, since we usually have class on Tuesday and Thursday, or at least that's when I post video, this or next Thursday is the 4th of July, so there won't be any class video. Um, Perhaps that might be an opportunity for you to think about paper number 2, because we will finish the class the following Tuesday. That happens to be July 9th, where we'll put some closure onto the awakening. And our very last class is the 11th of July, and that is when paper number 2 is going to be due, though certainly you can hand in early papers. And you can see that the 11th of July is also when we have our final exam. At 9 a.m. on the 11th of July is when you should have paper number 2 due and submit it into me, or paper number 2 done, I should say, and submit it into me so that you can focus completely on the final examination. And if this were a face-to-face class, we would be taking the final obviously in person, and you would have approximately 2 to 3 hours to complete that final. Obviously, this is not a face-to-face class, so I'm going to give you 24 hours to complete that final exam. Not that I expect you to spend 24 hours on the final. I expect you to spend maybe a couple of hours on the final exam. That would be due on the 12th, which is Friday at 9 a.m. That's when your final exam will be due, and that ultimately is when the class is done. And the final exam will be structured in terms of essays. It will be open book, open notes, so that you can ultimately reference things like our class notes and our class videos. The idea is that you're able to synthesize everything that we've been talking about over the course of the semester. And I'll talk a little bit more about the final as we get a bit closer to it. Obviously, I'm not expecting the kind of depth or the kind of sophistication that you would do in an academic paper, where you would have weeks in which to write it. You've got just hours. But you still should be able to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and should be able to put together some of the major ideas that we've been talking about over the course of the semester. So, in terms of Emily Dickinson, I did order a text of Emily Dickinson's poems, but if it turns out that you do not have that hard copy, I did find on the website Poetry Foundation just a sampling of her poems. She wrote over 1,000 poems, so obviously we aren't going to read all of her poetry. But this will give you an idea of some of the work that she's done. And what I really wanted to do was talk a bit about her life and her biography. There is a documentary. It is a little bit dated, came out in 1987, but it does a really nice job of talking a little bit about Emily Dickinson's life story, and it also quotes her poetry quite frequently. It's one of the reasons why I like this documentary, because it really gives you a sense of some of her writing. It's entitled Voices and Visions, and luckily I was able to find a free link online, and you can see in the notes below that I'm asking you to view that. One of the ways to think about her poetry is that it both reveals and conceals. As you will find out in the documentary, her poetry is quite challenging, even for the experts and the scholars. Her writing is quite unorthodox. She oftentimes capitalized words that we would normally not capitalize. She usually used dashes in the places where we would normally put commas. There's a lot of flexible rhyme in her poetry as well. Basically a defiance of convention, which is what we see in her lifestyle as well, and ultimately what we've seen throughout the entire semester, females defying many of the conventional expectations of the time period. And sometimes her poetry would follow the patterns of church hymnals, which was also rather defiant, because one of the things that she did was very clearly stated that she didn't believe in organized religion. It's one of the things that the documentary talked about. She actually stopped going to church, which was a big deal at the time period, considering her station and her status. She came from a well-to-do family from Amherst, Massachusetts, which is one of the reasons why Emily Dickinson is so important, I think, for us in particular, because she's local. I've even included the link to the Emily Dickinson Museum, and I encourage you to go visit. But One of the strengths, I think, of Emily Dickinson is being able to raise questions of the unknowable, being able to articulate in language feelings, and feelings are very difficult to explain. Certainly, there are dictionary definitions for feelings, but that's rather hollow compared to actually experiencing a feeling, and I think that she does that quite well. I have to admit, when I was in college, I really wasn't a fan of Dickinson, in part because I didn't understand her. I felt much better when I found out that scholars, too, oftentimes had struggles understanding her. She oftentimes talks about contradiction and paradox. Think about something like the woe of ecstasy, which is what you oftentimes see in her poetry. What I've learned about Emily Dickinson is not to necessarily assume that you need to understand a poem in its entirety. Sometimes just a line or two can be filled with meaning. And she would oftentimes talk about the state of the invisible and visible realms. Oftentimes she would discuss the afterlife as if she had better understanding of the afterlife of anybody. She would oftentimes write from the perspective of death. And while her poetry was very personal, it also is quite universal. I think it's one of the reasons why so many people embrace Emily Dickinson. And she portrayed death as a positive rather than a negative. So I know sometimes people say that Emily Dickinson is a dark poet. I don't necessarily think that's true when you think about the way that she portrayed things like death. Expect themes like loss and love and nature and loneliness and defiance, basically the entirety of the human experience. And she went to college in Mount Holyoke, which is also local, and you'll learn a little bit more about that in the documentary. So, in terms of reading Emily Dickinson, no, you aren't going to be reading 1,700 poems. What I'm going to ask you to do is to read one, and you get to select from all 1,700. Certainly, you can use the link of the website that I've included. It doesn't include 1,700 poems, but it includes quite a few. Or perhaps you have your own personal favorite, or you have your own Dickinson volume that you can select. I have a poem, actually, that I'll be sharing with you next class. I don't want to talk about it right now. You may or may not end up selecting the same poem I select. But basically, for your discussion forum response, which will be due on the 27th, this upcoming Thursday, though of course, certainly if you need an extension, let me know. I'm going to ask you to either identify one Emily Dickinson poem or even just a line within one of her poems that you find to be particularly powerful. You don't even necessarily have to understand it. And explain why you find it to be so powerful. Now, we've got 24 people in class. Assuming that you were to all write about something different, we would be exposed to 24 elements of Emily Dickinson's poetry, mine being the 25th. So I think that that's a good overview of Dickinson without your having to do a lot of reading, and also being exposed to Dickinson's biography. And the biography is about 56 minutes long, so I'm going to end my video here so that you can watch that. Voices and Visions, Emily Dickinson. And I look forward to seeing what it is that you choose, whether it be a line or a poem of Emily Dickinson for your attendance question. As you can see, as always, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm more interested in your reasoning. You aren't required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' responses. This is how you'll get a good overview of Dickinson's poetry. And my responses in turn. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I leave you with Voices and Visions, Emily Dickinson. Take care. Bye-bye.